All right, our next speaker is Dr. Dylan McNamara, and Dylan's been instrumental in getting the sustainability conversation started. Dick and I met with Dylan a few years ago and just started brainstorming about ideas. And he was our first guest lecturer at the club a couple of years ago, and I think it was awesome to get started in that realm. And his work, his research is on sustainability, including the interplay between the science and the physics and the economics and the social. And so it's really valuable to have his brain working with us, because we've been able to find out who do we need to invite to learn more, who do we need to bring to the conversation. And so today, just showing his skills, a couple of years ago was about the physics of coastal processes, and now it's going to talk about real estate. So I'm really interested to hear. And yeah, Dylan always gives us something to think about. Last year it was making the forest a person, which we're still working on that.
Yeah.
So, thanks, bud.
Thank you. I want to start by echoing what Chris said and thanking Dick and Pat. I have been in on these conversations from the beginning. It's been a real pleasure to get to know Dick and Pat. They're understated and very impressive people. I think many of you in the audience know them. And I will say that 3 years in, they've done a lot. This whole idea has done a lot to advance sustainability and the idea of sustainability. We've had wonderful discussions, interdisciplinary discussions, which a lot of times, big organizations like the National Science Foundation, they attempt to have these kinds of conversations, but we're having them and they've been really productive. So I've really enjoyed it. Perfect segue. I'm going to answer all your questions. Joe didn't answer any of them. I'm going to answer all. So if you don't mind, how many of you own a home here on Bald Head Island? Okay, great. I'm going to tell you exactly how much your home is going to be worth in 2063. Within a few $1,000s. We'll be close. So yeah, as Chris said, I kind of am a jack of all trades. My background's in physics, but this talk is going to be sort of an economics talk. The math in physics and econ, the only difference is jargon. So I can dig in that world just as well as I can dig in the world of physics. And it's sometimes more fun. It's been more fun in my career to dig into economics. So I am going to take a look at forecasting property values 40 years from now here on Bald Head Island. So with that cliffhanger, before I get that specific, I do want to kind of frame this discussion of economics in these kinds of settings by just thinking about the coastal zone writ large all the way around the world. And this is a great way to do it. This satellite image is filtered just so you can see city lights, and it gives you a good sense of population density and urbanization around the world. And one thing that's really striking, if you look close at different places, Australia, South America, and even when you look close in Europe, Scandinavia, and around the United States, you can see that the lights are really bright on the edge, right at the coastline. Over 40% of the population of the entire world lives within 100 kilometers of the coast. So it kind of begs the question for me as a scientist, so what characterizes that environment? If we were to look all around, all over the world, the way that humans are living in these places, is it very different or is it kind of similar? So let's begin to march around the world and take a look at what those locations look like. So this is near us. This is the Outer Banks of North Carolina. A very familiar scene, static infrastructure, tourism, significant tax revenue, the physical environment, sandy coastline, sea levels rising, storms, and mitigation, interactions with the environment, significant interactions with the environment. Beach nourishment in this case, the building of dunes. A very familiar site for us. So not unique to the East Coast of the United States, though. If we go over to the West Coast, a very similar scene plays out. Static infrastructure at the coastline, significant tax revenue, high property values. Physical processes, a little bit different, not quite as much sand. Some of the sand there comes out of rivers, gets lost down deep canyons, but still, mitigation is occurring, beach nourishment is happening, construction of seawalls. They tend to armor the coast a little bit more on the West Coast. Something like 10 to 15% of the entire West Coast is armored. But a similar configuration, a similar relationship between humans and the natural environment. Not unique to the United States either. This is Australia, Gold Coast of Australia. And if I had not said that, you would not know whether that was South Beach, Miami, or Australia. Again, static infrastructure, significant population density, again, a sandy coastline, sea level rise, storms, mitigation. So it begs the question, why so similar? And I know you're looking at these thinking, well, Bald Head is different. It's not that different. You know, similar kinds of interactions are going on, static infrastructure, tax revenue, mitigation, interactions with the natural environment. So what characterizes those relationships, the human and natural relationships in these systems? To think about that, it's worthwhile thinking backwards in time first and thinking about how humans characterize their interactions with the natural environment. And the way that I would say that is in sort of a physics sense is humans were strongly coupled to the natural environment on really short time scales historically, which means agriculture, clothing, habitation, all of those things were done in such a way that they were thinking on really short time scales about their impact on the environment and then how the environment would then impact them. Very short time scales. Today, we have very different relationships with the natural environment. And this picture, I think, says it all. I don't think the food that they're eating or the clothes that they're wearing or the temperature that they're feeling has that same linkage with the natural environment on short timescales. They've effectively filtered out that signal on short timescales. And along the coastline, the same thing has happened. It is a necessary thing to filter out those short timescale interactions with the natural environment. You're going to have a dynamic coastal setting like that and put static infrastructure on that dynamic coastal setting. The only way that you're going to be able to do that is to buy some time to put down that static infrastructure, let people live undisturbed, and generate economic value. And that happens through mitigation. That's what coastlines, human coastal systems do. Objectively, right? They mitigate, they build dunes, they suppress, they get rid of, they filter out small disturbance events. They buy themselves time to build structures and survive in that very dynamic environment. But what this does, the coupling doesn't go away. It just changes to a coupling on a longer time scale because eventually those mitigations are overwhelmed and damage occurs. So what happens, what characterizes our dynamical relationship with the natural environment is that humans are coupled to the natural environment in places like Bald Head and up and down the coast around the world. We are strongly coupled to the natural environment on longer time scales. It's different than the historical way. And that has huge impacts on how you think about what's going to happen in this system over decades and centuries. And a lot of the work that I've done has been to look at the impact of that coupling on those decadal to century timescales. And it's just sort of a kind of a quick run through my my CV of some of the papers that look at the impact of thinking about the system that way. And just to highlight a couple, one of the things that we found was that on sort of a century timescale, spatiotemporal patterns pop up in development and the way that the coastline evolves. That is really striking and is a significant function of the fact that humans are coupled to the environment on these intermediate timescales. We've done some work looking at tipping points to abandonment and what controls when these tipping points occur. And we've even done some looking at current time impact of that coupling and how you can have bubbles in property value, which is to say that the intrinsic value of property doesn't reflect, sorry, the current value of property doesn't necessarily always reflect its intrinsic value. And that's a common economic thing that happens in stock markets. But here it happens because it's a function of the fact that property value is related not only to how many bedrooms are in your house, but how wide your beach is and what the coastline looks like. None of these I'm going to talk about today. What I want to talk about today is a paper that I just had that came out. Policy and market forces delay real estate price declines on the US coast. So probably the simplest way to encapsulate what the driving scientific question was is I'm just going to read the first two sentences of the abstract. Despite increasing risks from sea level rise and storms, US coastal communities continue to attract relatively high income residents, and coastal property values continue to rise. A paradox, right? In Wrightsville Beach, where I live, after 3 or 4 storms in a row, there was a home listed not too far from my, well, far enough from my house that my home's not this, for $14 million. After 4 consecutive years of having a storm come through town. To understand the seeming paradox and explore policy responses, we developed the coastal home ownership model and analyzed the long-term evolution of coastal real estate markets. So that's what I want to talk about today, and just acknowledge some of the co-authors. Some of whom you know, Marty Smith was here the first year and gave a talk, and last year the dinner talk was given by Craig Landry. So I do lean on my economics colleagues to develop a model like this. So I'll just touch on, when I say develop a model, what the ingredients of the model are. I'm not going to show you the equations or anything. That's not very fun. But just give you sort of a schematic overview of the things that are in this model that allow us to turn the crank and then evolve something like property value into the future. So what is in the model is this view that I started with. There's a linkage between the natural environment and the human environment. There are coastal erosion dynamics. There's a shoreline that erodes, accretes, erodes. There are storms that come in, and that is linked to a property market, a real estate market. And so agents, that word agents in there means just active buyers in the market. People are looking at property, evaluating the risk in this sort of formalized way, making decisions about whether they want to buy property or maybe they want to rent the property. There are institutional investors in the model who can come in and buy large swaths of the property and then rent it back to people. That all generates a property value. That property value, then they decide, does this value necessitate doing things like beach nourishment? And so endogenously inside the model, they make decisions about whether they want to fight against erosion. And if they do, of course, then they are coupled into the natural environment. And then as that coast erodes, it impacts their property value. And so it links back to the economic environment. So there's the coupling. One of the novel things that's in this model is a formalized way to have an outside pool of buyers that can flux into the market when they see arbitrage opportunities. So if they see investment opportunities, they'll come in from the outside with different incomes and come in and buy coastal property. Okay, so that's kind of the ingredients that are all interacting inside the model. And then what I refer to as the forcing, or the sort of one-way interactions, are the things in colored boxes. So sea level's rising the entire time this is playing out. Storms are coming. There are outside property markets. This was another important piece to add. So the value of property here, say on Bald Head Island, is certainly a function of what's happening in the market, real estate market outside of Bald Head. So that is a knob that we control. We can raise the outside property market value, decrease it, and see what impact that has on the property values here. And then the other one that we explore is subsidies for beach nourishment. It turns out that that plays a really important role. How much money, like how much of the cost of beach nourishment does a community have to pay? Do they pay 100% of the cost? Wrightsville Beach historically pays something like 10% of their cost. In Bald Head Island here, it's a little bit different. So these are all the ingredients in the model. And I'll just give you the sort of take-home message from that work, and then we'll talk about applying it to Bald Head Island. But the take-home, one of the important things we found was that in this coupled system, we found that subsidies for coastal management, such as beach nourishment, tax advantages for high-income property owners, and stable or increasing property values outside the coastal zone all dampen the effects of sea level rise on coastal property values. The effects, however, this is the bad news, are temporary and only delay precipitous declines as total inundation approaches. That day is coming. I mean, it's not it's a sort of an objective fact. You know, sea level rise is going to get to a place at many locations up and down the East Coast where the current configuration is uninhabitable. So what we're interested in is understanding how that price decline happens, what controls when it starts, and what kind of things might hide or delay those declines. So with that rosy picture, let's apply it to Bald Head Island. So what I did, so that paper was kind of an exploration of sort of a generic barrier island community. And what I did for this talk was I went into the model and I tried to tweak it so that it reflects the things that I know to be true on Bald Head Island. First of all, we have a pool of buyers in the model. And so I didn't have actual data for this, but I tried to adjust the income to be what I would think would represent the Bald Head Island purchasing community, which tends to be a little bit of a higher income purchasing community than a typical, say, Carolina Beach. I got actual data from Joe on coastal erosion, so I plugged in from his satellite data, actual coastal erosion values, sort of ballpark. Chris was very helpful, getting me elevation data. That goes into the model too, how high the island is relative to sea level. And I also, as I mentioned, subsidies are important. How much the community has to pay the cost of beach nourishment is important. So Chris was kind enough to give me information about that. So I plugged all these things into the model. And now are you ready to see property value into the future? So here it is. So this is property value on the vertical axis, time on the horizontal axis. And we have two pools, two types of property in the model, oceanfront property and non-oceanfront property. The axis is fractions of $1 million. And I did highlight the Hadley event horizon. That's David's daughter. We're supposed to be thinking about that particular year, 2060. I thought it was 2064.
So we've got all kinds of different ones, 63, I think.
Yeah, 63 is the number. Yeah, sorry. And then here's beach width through time. So, and then I'll show one more thing from this. That's the same property value curve. And down here is income tax rate. So one of the things that we use in the model to kind of set up what the income of the buyers is what their marginal tax rate is. So you can see what's happening as time is going on is we're getting higher and people with higher and higher income tax brackets. So wealthier and wealthier people are coming in to prop up the property market. And so that red arrow right there, that's what I'm highlighting. Just like in the generic model, the same thing's happening in Bald Head. Namely, the risk is hiding from sea level rise. And even empirically, when economists have gone out and tried to find indications that sea level rise is making it into property markets, they can't quite see it. To Joe's point about signal to noise, that's still kind of in the noise. The signals that people see in property markets are many other things, the outside market increasing, interest rates, and so on and so forth. So they can't quite see it. So in this model, we can at least control it. We know that it's in there, but you cannot see it because the influx of wealthy buyers into the market, subsidies for coastal mitigation, and the fact that the outside market is staying relatively high props up the property value of Bald Head Island over a period of time until eventually declines occur. So I do want to point out, so this is just one simulation where I had to pick a rate of sea level rise. That's something we don't exactly know. There's a wide range of possibilities for this. All likely to lead to decline, I'm sorry to say, but the amount of decline can be significantly different depending on what rate of sea level rise I put into the model. So here what I'm just showing is that same property value curve through time with a sort of best case scenario sea level rise and a sort of worst case scenario sea level rise, all within the realm of possibility. I defer to my colleague who's the sea level rise expert, but these are within the realm, I think, of reality. So somewhere in that blue is where I would anticipate property value being. Some other interesting things that the model shows. This is an example where the outside market, remember I said there's an outside market, basically meaning property values sort of nationwide in similar kinds of environments. So, you know, the mountains, vacation homes in the mountains, vacation homes around lakes, things like this, and even the broader real estate market. If that, say, were to decline, what I did in this simulation was I started declining that property value outside of Bald Head Island on its own, for whatever reason you might invent. Some crazy interest rate situation or the collapse of banks, or you can invent whatever reason you want. So I start decreasing that property market and then see its impact on Bald Head Island. So I'm showing again my first simulation, what I referred to as the baseline simulation. Certainly if you decrease the outside market, the property value decreases in Bald Head even faster than it did in the baseline case. That's not that surprising. But what is interesting is that in Bald Head, the simulation, when I set it up, there's always this institutional investor that can come into the market and purchase properties. In the Bald Head simulation, they didn't do that. The fraction, what I'm showing here is the share of properties that this institutional investor owns. And it was 0 until the property market started to decline. The institutional investor jumps in. Notice the income of the people that are living in Bald Head now is starting to drop as you're having this significant decline in property value. The institutional investor jumps in, takes advantage of this, and then rents it back to low-income community. So it's kind of, the climate slum is a, it might not be the exactly appropriate term for this, but this is the idea that all of a sudden you're turning this community into a place where they're renting it back to people of low income and they're getting in harm's way. This is the idea of what a climate slum is. And I truly believe that something like this could happen to coastal communities up and down the East Coast. As those property values decline, if they decline precipitously, institutional investors will see an opportunity still to make money, and they will rent it back to the people who can afford it, lower income folks. So I call that a shark investor who's making money from the downfall of property. So the last thing I want to show is maybe I'm more hopeful. I thought it would be fun to try to think about what a policy alternative could look like, at least within the context of a model like this. And that is, can I control what this investor does? So what I decided to do was say, okay, imagine you take the investor and the folks that are living in Bald Head Island, and you say, you know what? How about you pay a premium to rent your homes, knowing that that premium, that extra cost is going to go into a fund to help things like environmental cleanup or moving of properties. So if you do that, this is what happens. This I call a benevolent investor. So this investor comes in early on, jumps in, buys the entire market, and then begins to collect rental revenue from the folks who live there. And not only rental revenue, but money on top of that that's going into a fund that can be used later. So there's the investor owning the market, and then they eventually jump out. But at this moment, when they jump out of the market because prices have gotten too low, first of all, notice property values were a little higher in this scenario than the baseline. Once they jump out of the market, there's a giant pot of money available to do all kinds of things. Move homes around. You know, one of the things that are going to be faced in a lot of communities is environmental cleanup. The sea level rises and storms come. Who's going to pay for that? This institutional investor, you could think of it like the government if you want, or just a benevolent investor, has come in and has a large amount of money to deal with those changes that need to occur. Maybe they just want to yank all the houses and move them back to the backside of there. Who knows? So I thought that was a fun policy alternative to explore. And we can do other things for the right price. So to conclude, I think that first bullet point is, it's not fun to think about, but it's probably a reality. Risk from sea level rise is currently hiding behind subsidies and outside market influences. You know, when you think about the lifetime of a mortgage, 30 years, we're not too far from a world where as soon as the market starts to think that sea level rise is going to be problematic in a 30-year time scale, the market will sniff that out. Insurance markets, et cetera, will sniff that out. And property values will begin to decline. And it's in there now, it's just small and hiding behind other things. Bald Head Island, relative to the generic simulations that we did for that work, the decrease happens a little bit earlier. Because the community is already relatively wealthy, there's not a pool of wealthy investors out there that are going to come in and prop up this market. I think it's already propped up. So the decrease happens earlier on Bald Head Island is one thing that comes out of this simulation. And I do think that, to be very specific on the Hadley event horizon, by 2064, I think property values here will have started to reflect sea level rise risk, and they will have decreased. Those numbers I have in there, whether or not they're perfect, who knows, but prices will have dropped. And so the question is, can we find an alternative path? What alternative paths do folks want to investigate? So I think these are good fodder for our roundtable discussion. So I'll leave it. Thank you.